Sandberg from Future Humanity Institute, talking about how good human enhancement would be.
Thank you. Okay, so I will be mainly focusing on cognitive enhancement because that's the area I have been studying the most and think I know the most about. I heard that you have Aubrey talking about life extension later on, which is interesting because it's kind of a fundamentally different thing. So, and of course, Toby gave a talk last time talking about existential risk, which I think is going to be rather hard for me to beat in terms of the impact. But I will give it a try. Yeah. Welcome, come in. Yeah. Yeah. So, basically, it seems that we have this little interesting predicament. We're about the stupidest possible species that can kind of take over the world thanks to our intelligence. A more stupid species wouldn't be able to do it. Our ancestors among the primates and the hominids, they weren't really smart enough to figure out how to build a technological civilization and get out of Africa. But our ancestors actually managed that. Of course, the problem was if they had somehow managed to evolve to be much smarter, they would probably done an even better job of it. The problem is, of course, we're stuck currently with what our intelligence we have evolved with. And this form of intelligence is pretty well suited to a life in small family groupings, living probably in a semi-arid landscape. So that's why reality soaps work so well. We can kind of understand the dynamics of a typical reality soap-sized group. And we have an intuitive understanding of physics, which might be rather Aristotelian. But that works pretty well as long as your technology actually doesn't get based on Newtonian mechanics or principles which are not visible. We have a lot of very nice affordances in our brain that allow us to solve a lot of problems quite well. And it's amazing how general they are. It's worth noticing that evolution didn't have anything that favored reading and writing. That was something we invented, but it could then piggyback on systems in our brain that have evolved for other purposes. It's very likely that a lot of our intuitive mechanics is also similarly piggybacked on different systems that might have been involved in motion planning. Indeed, it might very well be that a lot of our methods of actual thinking are kind of acceptations of what was basically a motor planning system that then got out of hand and allowed us to plan not just physical muscle actions, but mental actions, thinking about scenarios. What will happen if I do this or that? How will those people react to that? And so on and so on. The problem is, of course, now we have been using these wonderful mental abilities together with the equally powerful ability to have a cumulative culture. That is, if somebody invents something, we copy it and we keep it. Even when the original inventor is dead and forgotten, we keep the system. This cumulative aspect of our culture, of course, means that we have accumulated an awful lot of culture in form of institutions, technology, and inventions. Much more than can be learned and held probably in any individual human brain. And the downside is, of course, that now we're very dependent on these systems, which are extremely large, complex, and we don't understand them, but we need to keep them working because otherwise we are going to starve. And this is a bit annoying, of course. Even more annoying is that we have various threats, which are not only threats to these complex systems that we have a hard time understanding, but might come from the systems themselves, or indeed be very complex threats, again, that are very hard to understand. So it might be debated whether the financial crisis belongs to this completely ununderstandable category, but certainly very few people have expertise and understanding to deal with that. And it's fairly easy to imagine that in the future we might get other problems, which are, again, endogenous disasters that might require a mind that simply normal humans cannot achieve, or even perhaps the best humans. So, what to do about it? And the idea of cognitive enhancement is to try to fix this fact that we're pretty stupid and make us slightly less stupid and hope that some of these problems go away. And of course that the enhancement doesn't introduce enough new interesting problems. Because there is obviously a situation that if you get more and smarter brains, we're going to produce even more complex stuff. So there is this suspicion that maybe we're going to be able to solve our previous problems, but we're going to be great coming up with truly complex and devious problems. But if leaving that aside, what can we actually do to improve our cognition? So getting a good definition of cognitive enhancement is one of those messy things, because first, cognitive. That kind of presupposes that cognition is something separate from a lot of other activities that are happening in our brains. But as we all know, our emotions are strongly influence our cognition, sometimes in terms of biasing them, but quite often also by setting the tone or even the level of motivation. If you're cheerful and happy and energetic, you're going to think much better than if you're sick and depressed. So something that enhanced our health would actually act as a way of improving our thinking, although it's not normally regarded as cognition. There are also, of course, a lot of other aspects, like creativity, that traditionally are ascribed to some kind of more emotional or mystical side of our brains, rather than the information processing that people like to depict as something very pure and logical. But up here, of course, it's all the neurons. There is no clear separation. Similarly, defining enhancement is also a very fraught problem. So in the history of bioethics, people have loved debating this. There is a big literature about the treatment-enhancement distinction. And typically we have a kind of common sense understanding that treatment is bringing somebody from an unhealthy state back to normal, and enhancement is going beyond normal in some sense. And that might be a small thing, like me taking a stimulant drug so I can stay up later in the evening than I would normally do, or maybe something that made me smarter than the smartest human ever lived, which would not just be a kind of enhancement within my normal range, but would be outside not just the normal human range, but actually outside the normal human range. We don't really have that many examples of enhancement today that we can actually do that get there, at least in terms of an existing mental ability. It's one thing to talk about memory and intelligence, and they're rather tough to deal with. However, we can do some cheating, at least by adding new senses. So, for example, they're in a magnetic vision. You implant a magnet in your fingertip, and you can learn how to sense magnetic fields. This has enhanced your ability to sense magnetic fields outside the normal human range, because we can't sense magnetic fields. Now you're far outside that. It might not be the most useful thing, and I don't think it's going to change your life that much, but it has some interesting properties. But I'm mainly going to be trying to think about mental faculties that we normally think about when talking about cognition. Memory, attention, ability to stay awake, decision making, and hopefully intelligence. The problem is, of course, that even when we get to that point, there is still going to be a lot of discussion. Well, what about internal and external means? I'm using the smartphone as a little timekeeper to pace myself. Is that part of my mental processes? Well, we have Chalmers' idea about the extended mind. So to some extent, I might argue that, my smartphone is right now part of my extended mind. And we certainly use a lot of external equipment to improve our memories and maintain the attention, etc., etc. And similarly, we use each other as mental enhancement. I get the instant feedback from you in terms of what I'm saying. If you start looking completely confused, I will try to explain better and so on. And it might be argued that that actually some form of collective self-regulating process. So one might extend this concept of enhancement to include both groups of people and a lot of technology. And then, of course, bioethicists lose interest because they like to talk about pills and genetic engineering of babies. Because the internal, hardware-based ones, they're usually the ones that create the most interesting ethical debates. But I think this is a mistake to actually look at too much at the means. The really important question is rather, what do we actually achieve? Okay, so what can we achieve? Well, we have pretty good biomedical enhancements for attention, impulsiveness, sleep reduction, which is the most common one, of course, but it's of course very temporary, because if you just avoid sleeping, you're not going to get memory consolidation, and you're also going to get various health effects after a while, so it doesn't work by drinking too much coffee. Memory, and to some degree also, we might be returning to this oxytocin and pro-social behavior. Then there are various anecdotal and specific cases, for example, creativity enhancement by disinhibiting people are too inhibited. And there are various interesting claims for this and that enhancement method. One interesting thing is that it's much easier to enhance something where we have a kind of trade-off. For example, attention, we have a trade-off between focused attention and spreading our attention to notice events in our environment. And since we moved from an ancestral environment where things were kind of going on in a very distributed fashion to a rather austere environment that we have constructed where most surfaces are homogeneous, you don't get that many animals, at least deliberately not that many animals indoors. We kind of created an environment intended to focus attention. So we have changed that trade-off. However, of course, we might naturally have evolved to tend to have a rather wide attentional field, which means that enhancing it by focusing it would actually fit it much better to our current environment, which would, of course, make us completely lousy out on the African savanna when very big predators are around, because if we took enough Ritalin, we would ignore that tiger because there is an interesting paper to be written here. And conversely, of course, while going around in traffic, there might also be a bit of a problem if you enhance it. So one interesting problem is many enhancers seem to be rather task-specific, and this, I think, is a big downside, because that means that you need to tune them to yourself, to your task, and what you're doing right now, rather than generically improve your abilities. But let's make a quick run-through of various enhancement methods. So basically, improving health actually matters quite a lot. It's not just that it's distracting to have bad health. It's also that the energy resources in the body, there is a kind of tug of war going on between reproduction, the brain, immune system, and muscles. Depending on the trade-offs you get very different situations. So typically the brain takes about 20% of your total energy use, which is about as much as the immune system normally does. If you get an inflammation, the immune system probably revs up quite a bit, and the energy has to come from somewhere. And probably the brain gets less energy, as well as reproduction and so on. And you can imagine, of course, this kind of ongoing tug of war. And if you have a lot of disease, of course, you're probably going to find that the brain would tend to lose out quite a bit. So improving health can have a big effect, and that's also why we see pretty hefty effect, for example, of deworming. Young children, if you get rid of parasites, they do much better in school, and that's probably because now their brains actually get enough nutrients and energy to do their jobs much better. So one can certainly see a lot of these interventions as having a cognitive enhancement effect. Also, of course, we have various environmental threats like lead in the drinking water, which reduces the cognitive performance quite significantly. So getting rid of these environmental insults can have a pretty good effect. Again, one might argue this is more like treatment rather than enhancement, but you can imagine, for example, a region where it has always been a lot of lead in the drinking water, removing it. Now the population would reach and go up in intelligence in a kind of historical, unprecedented fashion. And it might be possible to do things like that. For example, iodine deficiency affects about 2 billion people in the world. And this is one of the probably easiest deficiencies to actually fix, because you just need to add a little bit of iodine to salt. And then that has pretty good population effect. So it's been estimated that we've actually been losing out on several billion IQ points worldwide due to this. And again, you might have this interesting situation where you have a population that has always been slightly lower in intelligence because of low levels of iodine in their diet. So if you give them supplementation, they will bounce back. And from their perspective, at least, it would be a kind of enhancement of the whole population. A lot of the criticism people have been doing against enhancement, it's interesting to see that whether they apply when you do this on a population scale against iodine. And some of these ethical arguments become completely absurd in this case. And it's not because it's a treatment or something, but it just demonstrates that, yeah, we tend to fall a lot for the framing. So when I describe something as enhancement, people tend to think about it in a certain way, which might be very distracting from actually considering what are the real effects of it. That's also why I find it very fun to point out things like that education is a pretty good but expensive enhancer, giving 2.7 IQ points according to one study per year, up to some level, eventually unfortunately levels off. And this is an enhancement that's so good that we make it mandatory and use tax money to pay for it. Obviously, education is doing much more than just improving people's brains. Ideally, we want children to actually get some knowledge. They should have some socialization. We want them to perhaps network a little bit and even learn a bit from schoolyard politics and things like that. So there is a lot of confluence of reasons why we want the schooling. But it's still an interesting thing to consider that some enhancement, if we're good enough, might actually be something we would regard as mandatory. Traditional methods also like memory arts are really amazing. Memorizing, for example, a deck of cards is fairly doable if you take the time to learn how to memorize it. Indeed, memory champions regularly don't memorize one deck of cards because that's too easy. I think the current record is about 3 or 4 decks of cards. Very useful in Las Vegas. But the problem is, once you learn how to memorize a deck of cards, you can't really use that to memorize phone books very easily. Although you can learn how to memorize phone books well, but that doesn't help you that much on decks of cards. So typically these memory arts are very subject specific. They're extremely potent within a subject if it has the right structure, but it doesn't carry over to other things. So this makes them a bit limited. Also, they take a lot of time to learn. We have interesting things with computer game training. So obviously, if you play a lot of shoot-'em-up games, you might train your attention. When there is some data showing that visual attention and itemization, the ability to instantly know how many of something there are, can be improved by playing a lot of shoot-'em-up games. But even more interesting, you can also do working memory training games, the M-back task, where you get a list of stimuli and occasionally need to recall what was n step back in this list. And if you set it up so it gets successively harder based on your results. And this is the tricky part. It must always be a challenge. Then not only does it train you at this working memory task, but it seems to carry over on Raven's progressive matrices, which is regarded as at least one rough measure of fluid intelligence. So this is quite interesting. And I think there is going to be a lot of development in this area, because also getting ethics approval for having people play computer games is much easier than giving them a drug. And again, of course, many of the ethical concerns people have about enhancing with drugs seem completely ridiculous when you apply them to a computer game, although when you look at the formal structure, it still seems like you should be concerned about it. So very interesting things going on there. Then we have the interesting forms of transcranial magnetic stimulation. You jostle the cortex with the right frequency and you can make it more excitable or less excitable. And this, depending on where you put it, can improve motor tasks and certain visual tasks. Essentially, any task that uses a piece of cortex that's fairly superficial, you seem to be able to manipulate this way. The downside is the effect sizes are really, really puny. So they're enough to get a p-value that allows you to publish the scientific paper, but I don't think it actually matters that much. The really impressive and strange thing is that it doesn't even require this expensive equipment using coils and magnetic stimulation. There is even direct current experiments where you simply send from one anode and a cathode across the brain, and if you do it in the right location, you also see improvement of certain tasks. So this has been Baron Roy Kadoch over here has done this for mathematics, although it was more learning arbitrary symbol mappings. And generally it seems that you can change brain plasticity, and if you know a part of the brain where you want to change plasticity, this might be useful. So it might be interesting to consider for language learning, for example. And of course some people are already taking batteries and putting them against their head and thinking they're getting smarter from it. But then, of course, we have food and drugs. So I have a long list of stuff that I found papers about supporting that you can do cognitive enhancement with. And many of them are experimental or very little studied. Others are very common. So alcohol, for example, is probably one of the most widely used disenhancers. But people are using it also for an enhancing purpose. Lowering inhibitions, mainly for social reasons. But some people actually use it to lower inhibition in order to engage in creative activity. And whether this works or not depends, of course, on who you are and how you see your creative activity. Where amphetamines are, of course, fairly well known, but generally stimulants, of course, well, they not only have make you more energetic and more alert, they also quite often do improve memory. Caffeine is, of course, extremely widely used, and then we have a long list of drugs, like the cholinergic drugs that were developed to treat Alzheimer's, that also have some effects on healthy people. Similarly, we have dopaminergic drugs, which also seems to have a nice effect. Glucose is, of course, my favorite one because it's cheap, it's legal, it's fairly safe, the side effects are well understood, and one can use it. But again, you need to optimize the intake. You want to have your blood sugar level to be at the right level, not too much and not too little. And that is fairly individual. Then, of course, we have my other favorite, modafinil, which has been fairly well studied as an enhancer. But overall, the problem is a lot of these drugs have kind of emerged from pharmacological research. They've not been developed as enhancer drugs per se. They just emerged as a treatment drug that people realize that it might be helpful for healthy people, or as part of neuroscience research. So we don't have that much of a push to really develop enhancement drugs. And this is mainly because if you want to get your drug approved, of course, by the FDA or European Drug Administration, you need to claim that it treats an illness. And the result is, of course, that we're making up a lot of illnesses these days. Half of Silicon Valley has declared that it suffers from narcolepsy and needs to have modafinil. And I think it's, by definition, 20% of us who are going to suffer from age-related memory impairment, because that's defined in terms of how many standard deviations you're away from the mean you are. Which is, of course, good news if you want to sell drugs. The downside is, of course, that a lot of people are now going around lying to their doctors or buying stuff from the grey market, online medical stores, which channels a lot of money into somewhat suspect or even downright dangerous medical smuggling operations. Not good. Okay, we also have some genetic enhancements that works at least in rodents, mainly for memory. In principle, we could probably do it in humans. It's probably just not worth the risk and effort, but you can get improvements there. And then, as I mentioned, external cognition and collective cognition, which in terms of actually achieving enormous results, we know best can actually do something. So it's quite easy to kind of get lost in all the interesting technology and biotechnology of the enhancement. But when we think about what achieves by stringing together brains, we realize that's a very cost-effective way of doing it. However, working together in a group also has a lot of limitations. We have limitations on our ability to communicate. We have various frictional forces in terms of bad incentives that leads to a lot of little politics. And we have various biases that emerge when we're in group and not individual. By designing the way the group works together or mediating in the right way, we might improve this. That's, for example, why Wikipedia functions probably so well. The technological underpinning allow a lot of people to communicate, so they can coordinate a much larger group than people could imagine doing this. But also they have invented new internal forms of structure that were not part of a technological underpinning, but they're inventing social underpinnings. So all the really successful big projects have this kind of feedback process where we get internal self-organization. And how that exactly works, I don't think anybody understands. I think it's a very important area of research, actually, to come up with how do we organize smart crowdsourcing, not just having a lot of people look at the problem, but having them organize themselves into something smarter. When it actually works, it's amazing how powerful it is. For example, some alternate reality gaming have been having effects that players form very tightly connected groups, working together and sharing knowledge and skills and solving exceedingly hard problems very, very quickly and effectively. Now, if we could turn that kind of collective brain power loose on a lot of other important problems, I think we would be doing pretty fine. It's just that we don't know how to do this reliably. Obviously, the fun of a game is part of it. That motivates people. But people can be motivated by the strangest things, like the Galaxy Zoo project here in Oxford demonstrates, where people are cataloging galaxies, which is not normally regarded as the most fun hobby activity, but it does have its devotees, and they are indeed not just contributing good pattern recognition, but their comments and discussion actually have discovered a few interesting astronomical phenomena. All right, so how much does all this matter? And this is where, of course, things get a little bit embarrassing. Because typically the standard paper on cognitive enhancement, especially drugs, typically give you 10 to 20% performance increase on something you measure in a lab. And the problem here is not just that it's just a few percent, but it's that it's a lab test. Typically you measure, for example, memory performance by how quickly a rat gets through a maze or finds a platform in a water maze, or the test subject, in the case of humans, how many answers they get in a certain amount of time. That's very different from the kind of intelligence we actually want out there. We actually want to write good papers. We want to be able to figure out solutions to the world's problems. And it's very much unclear how much these ones are going to help us there. And right now there is no good ecological data about it. Ideally, of course, we should take 50 PhD students and give them modafinil, and 50 PhD students give them sugar, and then after 5 years we check their publication record. We have independent reviewers checking and ranking their papers, and then we see, is there some systematic difference? That would be great. We just need to find funding, a very pliable ethics body for it. We also have this interesting question about the specificity. And this is where things get interesting. So, for example, taking caffeine makes you a bit more alert, which is probably a good thing if you're going to drive at night. But it will, of course, make you slightly more alert for practically any situation you're going to experience there. Caffeine also has some biasing effect, but it seems like some enhances enhance quite large areas, while others are much more specific, like the memory arts. So we might want to think about that. There is also an interesting few papers about that enriched upbringing is known to improve brains. You get more arborization of the neurons, they connect more densely together, we get overall a kind of smarter mouse, and it's generally believed that this works well on humans too. Growing up in an impoverished, boring environment is bad for your brain, while having a lot of friends and people around and an interesting, complex environment with things to pick up and investigate is good for you. It turns out that at least in rats, one can mimic some of these effects by giving some of these enhancer drugs. So by giving them to rats that are grown up in a boring cage, well, the brains grow, you get more branching, the learning ability go up to the same level as the rats that grew up in an enriched cage. It turns out that giving it to the enriched rats doesn't have much of an effect, which is interesting. So in this case, there is some kind of ceiling effect. This might be interesting from a development standpoint, since there are a lot of people who had a bad childhood. We can't fix that, but at least we can fix some of the kind of neurological impoverishment that might result from it. Assuming, of course, this works as well in humans as in rats. And that's another question. Imagine kind of getting ethics approval for trying out this on kids. I think it can be done, but one needs to argue the case rather well. So one interesting question is, of course, how much does cognition really matter? It's fairly common to say that IQ doesn't measure anything. And IQ is, of course, a very bad stand-in for real cognitive ability, which is very multifaceted. But a lot of it tends to be correlated. And I like to describe IQ a bit like measuring wealth by weighing all the possessions of people. It's not a perfect measure. Some really rich people have everything in their laptop and a small a bunch of credit cards. But most rich people have a whole pile of things, while poor people tend to have not such big piles. Except, of course, a few of them who happen to have a big pile. But generally, we tend to see that people that do well on IQ tests tend to do well on a lot of other interesting things. So obviously, standardized academic achievement, which is almost the same thing as an IQ test when it's not measuring cultural knowledge or facts. And of course, some job performance. And this, again, is interesting because it depends on how complex the task is. Digging ditches doesn't necessarily require much intelligence, but particle physics tend to do that. And again, some people argue that's because IQ measures don't really tell us very much about the form of intelligence that's involved in digging ditches. Well, I'm not going to get into the general debate about the G factor, the general intelligence, but it seems like, yeah, particle physicists are actually fairly good at digging ditches too, on average. It's just that they, of course, want a highly paid job. More interesting things is, of course, income. So here we might be making use of environmental toxin models that have been looking at, okay, how much losses of income do we get by losing intelligence because there is lead or mercury in the drinking water? And then we can imagine if it's just a question of small changes that they would be roughly similar if we had some anti-lead or anti-mercury that increased the intelligence in the same amount. And the result turns out to be about 1 IQ point is worth a few percent of IQ, a few percent of income. So in a later study suggested that 1 standard deviation of IQ would correspond to more than a 15% increase in wages. again, this is of course going to be modulated by what kind of economy there is around. If there is no market for particle physicists and they don't get well paid, this might be lower. But in any case, generally, in a higher intelligence, it seems to be fairly good in terms of occupational achievement. But more interesting, it also predicts health. Childhood intelligence is a pretty good predictor of longevity and health. Both in terms of that people seem to be taking care of their health better, having good health behaviors, but also in kind of general healthiness. We also avoid accidents and have lower delinquency rate. And more interesting, they have even lower rate. Smarter people are less likely to be murder victims. Exactly why this is, I don't know. One possibility might be that the problem is rather if you're dumb, you don't realize when you should get out of a bad situation. And generally, I think a lot of these effects might simply be that it's not the smart people who are doing amazingly well, it's that they avoid mistakes, which are easier to make if you don't have the cognitive capacity. There is also an interesting thing that the smarter people generally tend to be more economically rational, and in particular, the discount rates tend to be lower. They tend to take a more long-term view of the future. And this is, of course, quite intriguing. Again, there have been a very fun natural experiment about this. This was in the US military, where they happened to have, of course, intelligence scores for the personnel, and they had to retire a bunch of people. But they got a choice between either getting paid a lump sum now, here and now, or getting it over time. And of course, getting it over time is kind of more economically smart. And you could see the correlation between their mental scores and their willingness to take things further into the future. So there is some rather good evidence that we have more long-term orientation, more thinking about the future if you're smarter. It's of course easier also, you can imagine, because if you're smarter, you can envision the future, you can check data and facts and so on. Another very interesting thing, again from Jones, is that cooperation is higher. Again, in the various economic dilemma games, it turns out that higher mental ability tend to correlate with that people cooperate more in, for example, iterated prisoners' dilemmas. And again, this probably involves that you need to think about what the other person is thinking, and not just realize the kind of typical business school thing that, oh, and that's why I should be cheating directly from the start, but actually realize, and he's fairly likely if he's thinking like me, and so on and so on, to build up this rather fragile but elaborate structure that's needed to set up cooperation. Similarly, it turns out that unhappiness goes up if you're more stupid, and intelligence doesn't make you happy, but generally you get unhappy by not being smart. And then there is this interesting link between GDP and natural average intelligence, which if IQ is really controversial, you can imagine natural average in IQ. There have been a lot of stream of invective about that topic, but it seems like after that, the findings still seem to hold up. You might see this diagram I have on the third page. So the original measurements by Lin and Vahan, they have been hashed over endlessly, and they're probably based on slightly dodgy data. It's just that later data that is less dodgy also seem to correlate quite well with them. And typically the finding is that the countries where people are doing worse in intelligence tests also tend to have lower GDP. Now the question is, of course, cause and effect here. And there's probably a lot of interesting feedback going on, because you can obviously see, okay, you might have a poor country, so people have bad health, bad education, and not a very stimulating upbringing. Okay, that produces low cognitive abilities. But on the other hand, there are pretty good arguments that cognitive abilities, as I said, also promote good economic behavior. It promotes human capital, which would, of course, tend to increase wealth. So there are probably a lot of feedback loops going on here. And that is, of course, where we might start thinking, where in this feedback loop could we intervene and get the most bang for the buck? How much can we improve human well-being and human capital that way? There is also an interesting question, what do we actually need the people on the extreme upper end of the curve for? And generally, I think an enhancement of the lowest part of the population would be very good for them. and they wouldn't cost as much to the rest of the population. The middle part of the population, that's the bulk of people. That's probably going to have the biggest economic direct impact. However, we have the high performers who are very random in what they're doing with their lives and achieving. But for example, in terms of patents, which to some extent is a measure of how much you can crystallize your intellectual achievement into some form that might be socially useful, there seems to be rather significant difference between the high performers and the really high performers. There is, I mentioned here that there is the top 1/4 of the SAT score is very kind of twice as good in creating patents as the next little quartile. So it might indeed be very good for society to get more geniuses too. But kind of the average thing is probably around what the average person, that, now I'm starting to be incomprehensible, sorry. So the average person, that is probably where you get the bulk of the benefit, but the kind of really big solutions might indeed be happening at the extreme end of the curve. On the other hand, of course, we have questions like the Flynn effect. IQ scores have been rising. People have become better at solving IQ tests. Which doesn't seem to correspond necessarily to that the world has been filled by more geniuses. So it might be that we have been reallocating our intelligence from a very concrete, hands-on and practical solutions approach to a more theoretical one, which is very suited for IQ tests and theoretical symbol manipulating jobs rather than tending to the animals. Although, of course, tending to the animals requires quite a lot of intelligence too. So that has led to a reallocation to other forms of intelligence, which would suggest that maybe we should think about what forms of intelligence would we actually need the most of. Okay, I think I'm going to run out of time if I'm continuing at this rate, and I want to have a lot more discussion. So to get to the end here, one interesting thing is, of course, what do people actually want? It's one thing to say that, yeah, it would be good if we were all smarter. And as I've been suggesting, we don't have cognitive enhancement that creates smarts in general. We're pretty good at the partial forms. We haven't developed that good cognitive enhancements for pure intelligence, except maybe those N-back tasks. But we might want to aim at that if we, as a society, think that intelligence or other cognitive abilities are really important. However, people have very weird views in general about what they would personally want to enhance. So I have a little diagram, which might be slightly hard to read, but that was people's estimate. This was students at an American university, how fundamental certain traits were to the sense of self. Very loose concept, but there is a kind of really rough ordering. And then people were asked, would you like to take a pill to enhance this? And there is a pretty clear anti-correlation. Only 9% wanted to enhance with kindness. Professor Julian Savlescu shouted, "They're wrong," when he heard that first time. And I think he might be onto something. But in general, it seems that this kind of warm concept, the emotional, moral aspects of cognition, people are very worried about changing them. That might be getting too close to what they consider to be themselves. Meanwhile, the cognitive concept seemed to be fairly okay. Unfortunately, we didn't ask about intelligence in this survey. It's also interesting to see that there was no correlation between people's willingness to take this hypothetical pill and banning it in society. In general, it seems that people can be quite hypercritical about it. Oh yes, we really ought to ban pills that improve mathematics ability. However, I would take it if it was available. And it might be that people are worried about the competition effect, because I think that's one of the standard responses to enhancement. That, well, if the first thing people say in Europe is, "Oh, only the rich will get it," and then they realize that actually it's not too hard to make cheap pills. And then they're going to say, "Well, it's going to lead to a race." And I think people have an understanding that a lot of things we do are positional. It's better to be better than everybody else in it, but it's not that useful in itself. For example, at least in males, it's good to be tall, because then you can kind of tower over others, and that gives you a certain social status. So if we could easily enhance our height, of course, a lot of people would become taller, and now it would be a real disadvantage to be short, so people would like to become taller, and soon we will be all bumping into doors, and we wouldn't actually have an advantage. So I think this is partially why some people are very concerned about certain of these enhancements. However, it seems like memory has an absolute benefit too. It's actually useful to be able to remember what you learned in school or what you did on your holiday. So I think a lot of this is also going to depend on what people actually experience when they test them, when they actually get a chance to use them. And also, of course, the problem is that right now we don't make any enhancers based on what people want or what would be rational. It just happens to be that certain drugs that already exist can be used for these purposes. Okay. So another important thing here is, of course, that, as I said, drugs can come down in price because most of the chemicals going into them are not that expensive most of the time. Most of the cost is due to intellectual property or for developing them in the first place. So typically they come down in price, at least when the patents expire. Similarly for gadgets, it's an awful lot of very advanced technology in this one, but it's still fairly cheap, and it's of course going to get even cheaper when more and more knockoffs arrive. So gadgets typically go down exponentially in price. Meanwhile, services tend to stay at roughly the same level because you need to pay the salaries for the people involved. And this seems to suggest to me that enhancements that are kind of service-based, if you need to go to an enhancement spa to get your genes updated, they might be socially problematic, might not have an enormously big effect because we can't spread them very widely. Although, as schooling demonstrates, sometimes we're willing to pay an enormous amount of money to do it anyway. So this might actually lead to an argument that we should try to automate a lot of medical activities, both for enhancement purpose, but also perhaps in order to make them so much more cheaper. So that might be worth discussing. And as I said, framing has a really big effect. If you tell people, if you ask people, well, is it a good thing to enhance? If it's framed as a selfish benefit to themselves, people are skeptical, but as altruistic. Oh, enhance myself so I can help others. People become much more positive to it. And this might be argued that just the framing that affects them, because it's hypothetical. Most people don't recognize that they're taking enhancers. They don't really have a pill in their hand. But I also think it's actually true that people would like to enhance themselves if it helped others, which might lead to interesting situations. 1% extra IQ might be nice and beneficial for you individually, but the drug or whatever means come about to do it might have side effects. But it might be very good for society, as Jones has argued, because there are network effects. So we might have an interesting free rider problem if we actually were to get an enhancer like that. Maybe we would want everybody to take them, but I don't want to take that pill. I don't. It itches. So we might actually get interesting situations here between the individual benefit of enhancement and the social benefit. So the worries about the races, for example, that would be a neutral enhancement with negative externalities. We might also have some of the worries about enhancement that gives a very big individual benefit but no social benefit. That's the concerns whether the rich would enhance themselves to become even richer. Given the data I've been given, of course, it doesn't seem to work that way. Because becoming much smarter doesn't make you much, much richer and more powerful, especially since we can't make you much smarter. But it seems like the social effects are pretty big. So I generally argue that we're kind of close to the win-win corner with most enhancements we know of. But they might not be able to achieve these enormous increases in human welfare we've been discussing a bit earlier. I think, however, we might lower a bit of the friction of implementing some of the stuff we need to reduce existential risk and improve well-being in general. Well, that was that. Thank you.